Welcome to this program on Euronews. My guest on 12 Minutes With is Canadian Minister Anita Anand. Minister, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks
on
for having me.
Euronews. We are at NATO headquarters in Brussels, but I have to ask you before we get into defense about the politics, because Canada participated in a meeting, unusually, under the banner of the European political community. Why?
We were the first country to be invited outside of the EPC to the summit, and I attended with Prime Minister Carney last week, and we are very enthusiastic about continuing to work with Europe, with like-minded countries. You see that already in the SAFE agreement, in the Security and Defense Partnership, in CETA. This is part of a very close alliance and partnership.
And of course, in the European Union, there's now this debate, and obviously we can take it seriously or lightly, but it's out there, which is Canada potentially a member of the EU in the making? Is that something that you actively consider?
Well, look, what we're doing is certainly since the election of Prime Minister Carney last year is to diversify our trade relationships and really double down on this middle power initiative that the Prime Minister outlined in Davos. And that means working with like-minded countries, especially other middle powers, along a series of metrics, whether it is security and defense, whether it is economic interest, whether it's agriculture and agri-food, artificial intelligence. What you're seeing is Canada doubling down on alliances around the world.
And of course, the Prime Minister made a speech in Davos that made a lot of headlines. He also reiterated in Armenia that he does believe the global order as we knew it is changing, may not come back, but the new epicenter may be Europe. I got to ask you, however, would we be here talking with this tone and sort of this conversation had President Trump not been elected? That is a big question for Europeans. Is this convenient, or is this actually a relationship that makes sense?
What I believe we should be looking to is how can we work together pragmatically for our respective countries in order to deliver economic benefits and defense and security benefits. That's what we're focused on in Canada. And indeed, over the last year, we've signed over 20 security, defense, and economic agreements around the world, and we're just getting started. Prime Minister Carney referred to it as a rupture in the global system. What this rupture means is that we can either retreat or we can step forward as a middle power, form alliances, and ensure that we're delivering pragmatically for our domestic population. That's exactly Canada's approach right now.
Just to fully understand for a European audience, what you say is these relations will now stand the test of time. This is not a response to Trump 2. You believe there is potential now to build something in the medium, long term.
They will stand the test of time. The reason being is that it's not just a policy response.
It's not just a policy response.
The policy response is based on like-mindedness, on shared values, on the belief that territorial integrity, state sovereignty, multilateral trade are important values that we will continue to work collectively for in the short and the long term. And I can't leave without mentioning Ukraine.
Of course.
I'm here in Brussels to announce additional sanctions, 28 new sanctions against Russian entities and individuals in favor of Ukraine and their position on Ukraine. We've committed almost $26 billion for Ukraine's sovereignty and the rule of law, and we will continue to stand with Ukraine in the short and the long term.
And also, I do have to ask you a question, however, on Ukraine. There has been a lot of zeitgeist over the weekend about whether or not there should be mediation that is no longer the U.S. and Russia talking together, but also a European delegation. Potentially, I wonder if Canada would be interested in joining those talks. But do you believe this is now the right time to talk directly to Russia through the Europeans, not the United States?
I will say, and I've said it before, that the decisions about Ukraine's future rest with President Zelensky. We believe that any mediator that is chosen must be one that Ukraine agrees with. And in particular, we want to see a ceasefire, which Volodymyr Zelensky agreed to respect it. And what we've seen is Russia violating ceasefires, violating commitments, violating international law, unjustifiably and illegally killing Ukrainian individuals, soldiers, and stealing Ukrainian children. That's unacceptable. Canada stands firmly against Russia on all of those measures.
But going back to the issue of mediation, because it seems now that the Ukrainians themselves understand that at some point the European Union will have to have one-on-one conversations with Russia. Otherwise, it's President Trump who's going to be at the table. It's not clear that he has the best interests of Europe or Ukraine in mind. If this is a mediator that the Ukrainians agree with and the Europeans agree with, will Canada support it?
I want to reiterate, Canada supports the work of the Ukrainian government and President Zelensky. And let's just say that Ukraine is standing strongly. What you're seeing now, in fact, are countries coming to Ukraine's defense as well as coming to Ukraine for their expertise on the battlefield, including in drone technology.
And on that note, you talk about a world that is in commotion. Obviously, it is in commotion in the Middle East too. President Trump has also indicated that he believes NATO countries that should have helped, have not done anything for NATO, and they are totally a paper tiger. How do you see your position evolving in the situation in the Middle East?
Middle East ceasefire needs to be permanent. And that means that the Strait of Hormuz needs to be freely navigable as required under international law.
Which they're not doing now.
That means that those retaliatory attacks against Gulf states need to stop. And that means that Iranian nuclear proliferation needs to be discontinued. And all of those are central to Canada's foreign policy right now. We are standing with our partners in the Gulf.
But when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, who's going to reopen the Strait of Hormuz? Because this is causing massive ramifications around the world, global economy. In Europe, we talk about stagflation, potentially a recession. Who's going to reopen it? Because it's clear the U.S. cannot do it alone.
You're exactly right. The ramifications economically and from a humanitarian perspective are deeply troubling and worrisome. The global economy is under severe threat as a result of 20% of global energy supplies being at a chokehold in the Strait of Hormuz. But it's not just energy, it's fertilizer, it's helium, and international law dictates that that strait must be open, and it must be part of the negotiation that the parties are undertaking.
So your position's not changing. As long as a war, there's a hot phase, you're not getting involved. If there is a resolution on the table, then you could consider being part of this navigation mission.
Once there is a permanent ceasefire in place, Canada would be prepared to consider ways of contributing, such as in demining expertise or in cyber expertise or in data and knowledge and logistics. But those are the purview of the Minister of National Defense, and he has been working very closely with colleagues, as have I, on the diplomacy side.
Of course, and Minister, looking forward to NATO. Of course, Canada now got to the 2% spending of GDP. Canada, of course, Canada have also said repeatedly that it will take security and defense now. Crucially, it's imperative. This is a government priority. And yet, I wonder, however, is that going to be enough to have a constructive summit going into Turkey? What kind of meeting are you expecting in Turkey? Because if I look at this, the message that I get is not that of a strong NATO. There's a lot of tensions within the institution.
NATO is a resilient organization. Canada is a founding member of NATO, and we will always stay at the table to have the difficult conversations, as we did in reaching 2%, as all of the countries agreed to last year in reaching 5%. And so I will be with the foreign ministers of NATO next week in Sweden to have the conversation about what to expect in Turkey in July.
The reason why I ask, is it constructive, is that if I was sitting at the table, I'd say there's a lot of expectations on allies. They need to help. They need to pay. They now need to pay 5%. And what I hear in retribution is language that at times is not just aggressive, but is disrespectful. It is disrespectful to allies. Is that something that you factor in these conversations to say, yes, we are constructive, but we need to see a different mood too? This language is not acceptable.
So I've been around this table for a number of years. I was the Minister of National Defense in 2022 when Russia further illegally invaded Ukraine, and have been participating in these NATO summits. And I will say that prior to the NATO summit, there is usually a conversation about what would be delivered. This year, we will again have difficult conversations, but NATO is a resilient organization. We will not always have complete unanimity, but we will always have participation at the table and working towards a solution that represents the best interests of collective defense and security.
And just finally, what assessment do you make of the performance of the Secretary General? As you know, particularly here in Europe, he has come under pressure by a number of European countries who say your job is to cater to the alliance, not one member state. And that is, of course, the U.S., a reference to President Trump. Is that something that you would subscribe? This is a Secretary General that needs to work for all?
He has been a very significant partner for us, especially on the Arctic. You'll recall we were pressing when we were opening that consulate in Greenland for an Arctic strategy from NATO. NATO came forward with Arctic Sentry, which is an operation. We'll have a deeper conversation about a broader Arctic strategy. So, yes, I look forward to working with Secretary Rutte in the months and years to come.
Well, Minister, thank you so much for joining us on Euronews. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.